Special forces crashed through the restaurant doors at the height of the celebration, automatic weapons drawn, shouting commands that cut through the laughter and clinking glasses. August 31st, 2008. The Tiflis restaurant in Yalta, Ukraine. 28 men hit the floor, faces pressed into expensive carpet, hands zip-tied behind their backs. These weren't ordinary diners. They were thieves-in-law, vori v Zakone, the highest caste of the post-Soviet criminal underworld, gathered to celebrate the 54th birthday of one of their most influential members. Among those face down on the floor, surrounded by half-eaten plates of khachapuri and overturned glasses of Georgian wine, was Sergey Ivanovich Lysenko, known throughout the former USSR as Lera Sumskoy. By the next morning, all 28 would walk free. No charges would stick. The law, it seemed, had little power over these men who lived by a different code entirely. This is the story of how a street hooligan from a provincial Ukrainian city became the most powerful criminal authority in a country of 40 million people. A man who allegedly controls an entire region more effectively than its elected officials, who has spent 23 years behind bars across 6 convictions, yet remains untouchable, who operates openly while law enforcement watches helplessly, and who would eventually face an impossible choice between the criminal code he'd lived by for 50 years and the survival of his homeland. It's a story that reveals the rotting infrastructure of post-Soviet justice, the blurred lines between legal authority and criminal power, and the strange, brutal world of the thieves-in-law, a criminal aristocracy that emerged from Stalin's gulags and still operates today. Sergey Lysenko was born on August 31, 1954, in Sumy, a city in northeastern Ukraine near the Russian border. The details of his childhood remain sparse, deliberately obscured by the man himself and those who knew him. What is documented is that he showed little interest in education and considerable talent for violence. By his teenage years, he'd established himself among local street gangs, earning respect through fists rather than words. The Soviet Union of his youth was a society of shortages and rigid control, where the official economy barely functioned and the shadow economy, black markets, theft, protection rackets, thrived in the gaps. Young men like Lysenko found opportunity in these gaps. In October 1972, barely past his 18th birthday, Lysenko received his first conviction. The charge was hooliganism, a catch-all Soviet crime that could mean anything from public drunkenness to assault. He was sentenced to 2 years in a Soviet labor colony. For most young men, this would have been a deterrent, a shameful interruption to normal life. For Lysenko, it was an education. Soviet prisons and labor camps operated according to a strict hierarchy that had nothing to do with the official prison administration. At the top were the thieves-in-law, criminals who had formally renounced all ties to conventional society, who refused to work for the state or cooperate with authorities in any way, and who settled all disputes according to the thieves' law, vorovskoy zakone, a set of unwritten rules that governed the criminal underworld. Lysenko later recalled his first imprisonment with a coldness that characterized his entire approach to criminal life. "I wasn't scared at all when I first went to prison. Life is one, whether here or there, just different conditions." This wasn't bravado. For Lysenko, prison became home in a way that freedom never would. Between 1972 and 1992, he spent more time behind bars than outside them, cycling through a series of convictions with brief intervals of freedom in between. Just 18 months after his first release, he was arrested again. This time, the charges were more serious. 9 separate counts, including theft and illegal weapons possession. The pattern established itself early. Release, crime, arrest, prison, repeat. During these years, Lysenko wasn't merely serving time. He was building a reputation. Soviet prisons were schools of crime, where young criminals learned from veterans, where hierarchies were established through violence and cunning, and where those who showed strength and adherence to criminal codes rose through the ranks. Lysenko proved himself repeatedly. In colonies near Kharkiv and in Lviv Oblast, he organized mass prisoner protests and riots against the administration. These weren't mere outbursts of frustration. Organizing successful resistance against guards and administration demonstrated leadership and commitment to thieves-in-law, which required thieves to oppose state authority at every turn. Each act of rebellion, each refusal to cooperate, each successful challenge to the system added to his criminal resume. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but Lysenko remained behind bars. By then, he had spent nearly 20 years in the system, more than half his life. He had learned the criminal code so thoroughly that it had become his only code. The skills useful in free society, holding a legitimate job, maintaining normal relationships, following legal rules, had atrophied through disuse. But the skills useful in the criminal underworld, reading power dynamics, organizing collective action, maintaining respect through strategic violence, navigating complex informal hierarchies, these he had mastered completely. When he finally emerged from this cycle of imprisonment in the early 1990s, he entered a Ukraine that was itself lawless, chaotic, and up for grabs. The early 1990s in former Soviet territories were years of spectacular disorder. State authority had collapsed. The economy imploded. Criminal groups filled the vacuum, controlling everything from street markets to major industries. This was the era of the Bratva, brotherhood, when criminal organizations operated openly, when businessmen paid tribute to gangsters for protection, when contract killings became routine, and when the line between criminal and businessman, between gangster and government official, blurred to invisibility. It was in this chaos that Lysenko saw his opportunity. But he wasn't seeking to build a criminal business empire like many of his contemporaries. The new generation of post-Soviet gangsters, often called businessmen in tracksuits, were accumulating wealth, buying property, investing in legitimate businesses. Many were abandoning the old thieves' traditions, which prohibited owning property, having official family, or cooperating with authorities. Lysenko remained committed to the old code. He wanted something else: status within the traditional criminal hierarchy. He wanted the title that represented the peak of this hierarchy: Vor v Zakone, thief-in-law. The institution of thieves-in-law originated in Stalin's labor camps during the 1930s. As the Gulag system expanded to hold millions of prisoners, authorities found the population impossible to control directly. They relied on criminal prisoners to keep political prisoners in line, creating a system where criminals held informal power within the formal structure of state control. The thieves-in-law emerged as the elite within this system. Criminals who refused to work for the state, unlike other prisoners who labored in mines and construction, who followed a strict code and who commanded absolute loyalty from lower-ranking criminals. They were crowned in ceremonies that granted them authority over criminal matters, the right to collect tribute, and the obligation to support imprisoned criminals through a collective fund called the Obshchak. By the 1990s, the institution had evolved but remained powerful. Being crowned as a thief-in-law required sponsorship from existing thieves, a proven criminal record, years of prison time, and, most importantly, absolute adherence to the thieves' law. Lysenko had the record. He had the prison time. He had built relationships with established thieves during his years inside. In August 1993, he achieved his goal. The coronation took place at the Vechornitsy restaurant in Sumy, Lysenko's hometown. The ceremony followed ancient criminal rituals. Multiple thieves-in-law had to be present to validate the crowning. Lysenko's primary sponsor was Alexander Kochev, known as Vasya Korsh, a highly respected thief from an earlier generation. Also supporting his coronation were Yuri Ivanov, Nodar Farisian, known as Nono, and Zakary Kalashov, Shakro Molodoy, who would later become one of the most powerful crime figures in Russia. The gathered thieves questioned Lysenko about his criminal history, his prison record, his understanding of thieves-law. They evaluated his worthiness. Finally, they granted him the title, making him Lera Sumskoy, a thief-in-law with authority over criminal matters in his region. But the coronation wasn't unanimous. Tamaz Pipia, known as Tamaz Sukumski, categorically refused to recognize Lysenko as a legitimate thief. The reasons for this refusal remain unclear. Perhaps personal animosity, perhaps doubts about Lysenko's adherence to the code, perhaps competition for influence. This opposition would create complications for years. In the world of thieves-in-law, recognition matters. A thief not recognized by other thieves has questionable authority. Lysenko would have to prove himself repeatedly to silence these doubts. The years immediately following his coronation saw Lysenko consolidating power and continuing his pattern of arrests. He spent time in Moscow, building relationships with Russian criminal authorities. He maintained connections across Ukraine's prison system, and he kept getting arrested. In 1996, he attended the funeral of his godfather, Vasya Korsh, who had died of natural causes. At the cemetery in Kharkiv's Lysaya Gora district, as Lysenko paid his respects to the man who had crowned him, police moved in. They arrested him on charges of deliberate property destruction. The case went to trial. On July 19, 1997, Zhovnevy Court in Kharkiv sentenced him to 6 months and 9 days, exactly the time he'd already served in pretrial detention. He walked free from the courtroom. Less than a year later, in May 1998, his luck ran out. Authorities charged him with leading an organized criminal group in Sumy Oblast, engaged in extortion, robbery, and racketeering. The prosecution presented evidence of systematic criminal activity, businesses forced to pay tribute, violence against those who refused, a network of subordinates executing his orders. The court convicted him and imposed a sentence of 7 years in prison. This would be his longest stretch behind bars and his last major conviction. He was 44 years old. Even in prison, Lysenko maintained his status. A thief-in-law doesn't stop being a thief because of incarceration. Prison is where thieves' authority is most visible. He continued mediating disputes among criminals, enforcing thieves' law within the colony, and maintaining connections with the criminal world outside through a network of supporters and subordinates. The 7 years passed slowly but purposefully. When he emerged in August 2004, on his 50th birthday, he walked into a Ukraine that had changed dramatically, but where the criminal underworld remained a powerful, parallel authority. Lysenko made an unusual decision for a Ukrainian criminal authority. He relocated to Moscow. He lived in the Russian capital for extended periods, not hiding in shadows, but operating openly. In Moscow, he continued building relationships with Russian thieves-in-law, particularly those aligned with the Slavic wing of the criminal world, as opposed to Caucasian criminal networks. These connections would prove crucial in the power struggles to come. During this period, he also did something technically forbidden by thieves' law. He acquired a wife and fathered a son. Traditional thieves' code prohibited official family ties, considering them a connection to conventional society that compromised criminal independence. But by the 2000s, many thieves were bending this rule. Lysenko's son would grow up in Moscow and would later himself serve prison time, continuing a family tradition of criminality. In 2006, Lysenko returned to Ukraine, specifically to his home city of Sumy. He was immediately detained by local police. They held him briefly, questioned him, and released him. This pattern would repeat itself constantly over the coming years: detention, questioning, release. Ukrainian authorities were well aware of his status and activities. Multiple ministers of internal affairs made public statements vowing to eliminate the influence of thieves-in-law. Task forces were created, operations were launched, but effective prosecution proved impossible. Without catching him in the act of committing specific crimes, authorities couldn't hold him, and Lysenko was careful. By this point in his career, he no longer personally committed crimes. He mediated disputes, collected tribute through subordinates, and maintained authority over the criminal hierarchy. These activities were criminal in spirit, but difficult to prosecute under existing law. In 2007, Lysenko attempted to expand his influence into Kiev's left bank, targeting small businesses, trading points, and parking operations. But he encountered resistance from Ukrainian police, specifically from the Special Organized Crime Unit. After what sources describe as a confrontation with authorities, he retreated back to Moscow. This setback was temporary. His influence continued growing, particularly within Ukraine's prison system, where he maintained a network of overseers, смотрящие, criminals loyal to him who managed internal prison affairs according to his directions. Then came the birthday celebration in Yalta that opened this story. August 31st, 2008. The Tiflis restaurant. 28 detainees, including multiple thieves-in-law from Russia and Ukraine. The raid made headlines. Deputy police officials gave interviews describing how they disrupted a major criminal summit. But within 24 hours, all but one of those detained were free. One man wanted on international warrants was held. Lysenko received a fine for resisting arrest. The rest walked away. As one investigator later commented with dark humor, "Our domestic mafiosi have watched too many Italian Cosa Nostra films where birthday parties are actually criminal conferences." The incident revealed the fundamental problem facing Ukrainian law enforcement. They knew who these men were. They knew their status in the criminal hierarchy. They had them physically in custody. But without specific evidence of specific crimes committed at that specific moment, they couldn't prosecute. And the criminals knew it. The birthday party wasn't hiding. It was a public event at a known restaurant. The thieves-in-law weren't operating in shadows. They were operating in plain sight, confident that the legal system lacked the tools to touch them. Just months later, in February 2009, Lysenko was detained again. This time in a Kiev restaurant where, according to police intelligence, he was meeting with other criminal authorities to discuss redistribution of spheres of influence in western and central Ukraine. When arrested, he resisted. In his vehicle, police found firearms. They also found methadone, a narcotic. Once again, he was released, under a written promise not to leave the jurisdiction. The promise meant nothing. Within months, a major development would reshape the Ukrainian criminal landscape and dramatically increase Lysenko's power. In 2009, Antimos Kukutievich Kukilava, a Georgian thief-in-law known as Antimos, was deported from Ukraine to Georgia. Antimos had been one of the most powerful criminal authorities in Ukraine, representing Caucasian interests. His removal eliminated a major competitor. Then, in November 2011, something even more significant occurred. Sergey Mamedov, known simply as Mamed, died of stomach cancer. Mamed had been enormously powerful, controlling what was effectively a Republican-level obshchak, the collective criminal fund. His death created a vacuum at the absolute top of Ukraine's criminal hierarchy. What followed was a war, not with guns, though violence certainly occurred, but a war of influence, alliances, and legal maneuvers. On one side stood Caucasian thieves-in-law, Sergo Glonty, known as Guga, Ramaz Tikoridze, Ramaz Kutaisky, and Bakish Aliyev, Vaka. Supporting them was Valery Sheremet, Sharik, the oldest Odessa thief-in-law. These men represented the powerful Caucasian wing of the criminal world and claimed right to control Mamed's obshchak and his territories. Opposing them stood Lysenko. Supporting him were Russian thieves-in-law aligned with the Slavic wing, Anatoly Yakunin, Senka Samarsky, Yuri Pichugin, Pichuga, and Vasily Kristoforov, Voskres. These men were connected to the clan of Ded Hassan, Grandpa Hassan, one of the most influential criminal figures in Russia at that time. The conflict played out through a series of arrests, some seemingly legitimate and others clearly manipulated by competing criminal groups with connections inside law enforcement. One by one, Lysenko's Caucasian competitors found themselves detained, deported, or forced to retreat. By 2012, Lysenko's faction had won. He emerged as effectively the most powerful thief-in-law in Ukraine, controlling or strongly influencing criminal affairs across most of the country. In May 2012, he was detained once more in Kiev's Holosaivsky district, along with other thieves-in-law, including Yuri Pichugin and Alexei Salnikov. According to police, they were holding a gathering to formally appoint Andrei Nedzelsky, known as Nedelya, as the overseer for Kiev. This was a crucial appointment. Kiev, the capital, was the most important criminal territory after the regional strongholds. By placing Nedelya there, Lysenko extended his influence directly into the political and economic heart of Ukraine. Just weeks later, June 2012, Lysenko was detained again, this time at Kiev train station in Moscow. He'd traveled to the Russian capital to meet with other thieves, presumably to inform them of the new arrangements in Ukraine. Moscow police conducted what they called a preventive conversation, explaining that his presence in Russia was undesirable. Lysenko reportedly took this with understanding, promising to leave on the next train. These detentions had become routine, almost ritualistic, authorities going through motions to demonstrate they were doing something, while both sides understood nothing would come of it. In August 2013, another detention, this time at the Lashtochka restaurant on Moscow's Luzhnetskaya embankment. Again, he was taken to the police station, questioned, and sent back to Ukraine. These repeated detentions in Russia suggested that Russian authorities, while maintaining connections with Russian thieves-in-law who supported Lysenko, didn't want Ukrainian criminal authorities operating too openly in Moscow. The geopolitical complexities of the criminal underworld mirrored the geopolitical complexities between the two countries. But back in Ukraine, Lysenko's power continued growing. In 2013, Gennady Moskal, then a member of Ukraine's parliament, made an explosive public statement that would be quoted in virtually every subsequent article about Lysenko. Sumy Oblast is ruled not by the governor, but by the criminal authority Lera Sumskoy. Lera effectively controls the entire oblast through his subordinates, the governor, the mayor, the heads of district state administrations. The police chief, the prosecutor, the SBU, Security Service of Ukraine, the heads of administrations cannot resolve issues that are within the reach of thieves-in-law. This wasn't hyperbole or political exaggeration. Multiple sources confirmed that Lysenko maintained a network of connections throughout Sumy Oblast's power structure. Whether through corruption, intimidation, or simply the reality that criminal networks could solve problems that bureaucratic systems couldn't, Lysenko had become a parallel authority. When businesses had disputes, they might go to Lysenko rather than courts. When local officials needed something done, they might coordinate with Lysenko's people. The formal government structures and the criminal power structure had become so intertwined that separating them was impossible. Sumy's mayor at the time, Gennady Minayev, furiously denied Moskal's allegations, calling them the ravings of a senile old man and dismissing the entire interview as garbage. But the denials rang hollow. Too many people knew the reality. Lysenko operated openly in Sumy. He was seen in restaurants, at public events. Everyone knew who he was, and everyone knew that crossing him could have consequences that the official justice system might not prevent. The scope of Lysenko's criminal enterprises extended far beyond simple territorial control. By the mid-2010s, according to law enforcement sources and investigative reports, his network's interests encompassed multiple lucrative sectors of the shadow economy. Underground gambling establishments operated across Sumy Oblast and beyond. Casinos that existed in legal gray zones or outright violation of gambling restrictions. These weren't small-time poker rooms and basements. Some were sophisticated operations with modern equipment, security systems, and regular clientele, including local businessmen and officials. The profits were substantial, and a percentage flowed upward through the criminal hierarchy to Lysenko's obshchak. Protection rackets, what criminals call roofing or providing a roof, formed another major revenue stream. Businesses, particularly those operating partially or entirely in the shadow economy, paid regular tribute for protection. This protection had two aspects: defense against other criminal groups and assistance navigating corrupt bureaucracy. A business under Lysenko's roof wouldn't be shaken down by competing criminals. It might also find that inspections went more smoothly, that permits were easier to obtain, that disputes with competitors resolved favorably. The system was self-perpetuating. Businesses paid for protection partly because other businesses paid for protection, creating an environment where operating without criminal backing became nearly impossible. Illegal alcohol production represented another significant operation. Underground vodka factories, operating without licenses, without quality control, without paying taxes, produced cheap liquor that undercut legitimate producers. These operations were particularly profitable because the overhead was minimal and demand was constant. The vodka was sold through networks of small shops and kiosks that also paid tribute to the criminal structure. When authorities raided these factories, they usually found the operation had been tipped off hours earlier and the facility emptied. The connections between criminal networks and law enforcement made effective crackdowns nearly impossible. More seriously, Lysenko's network was linked to drug trafficking and weapons trade. These connections were harder to document precisely because they operated through layers of cutouts and subordinates. But law enforcement intelligence suggested systematic involvement. Drugs moved through Ukraine from east to west, from production areas in Central Asia and the Caucasus to markets in European Union countries. Ukraine's position as a transit country made it crucial to trafficking routes. Weapons were even more sensitive. Surplus from military stockpiles, illegal imports, firearms that disappeared from police evidence rooms. The trade in weapons connected criminal networks to political instability, to separatist movements, to the kind of violence that could destabilize regions. In 2015, an investigation revealed something that contradicted the traditional image of thieves-in-law as ascetics who owned no property. Lysenko had illegally acquired 2 land plots in Sumy Forestry District. The revelation was significant because thieves' law explicitly prohibits owning property. Possessions tie a thief to conventional society and create vulnerabilities. But by the 2000s, many thieves-in-law were quietly abandoning this principle. They maintained the image of living by the code while accumulating assets through relatives' names or shell companies. The hypocrisy was obvious, but rarely discussed openly within criminal circles. Lysenko's land acquisition showed he was pragmatic enough to adapt even the sacred codes when it served his interests. But his most significant power base wasn't businesses or land. It was the prison system itself. Lysenko maintained what amounted to a parallel administration within Ukraine's correctional facilities. In colonies across the country, he had overseers, смотрящие, who managed internal affairs according to his direction and thieves' law rather than official regulations. These weren't guards or administrators. They were prisoners, but prisoners with authority that sometimes exceeded that of the warden. The system worked like this. Within any prison population, a hierarchy exists. At the bottom are the offended, prisoners considered outcasts, often sex offenders or those who violated criminal codes. In the middle are regular prisoners. At the top are the authoritative prisoners, those connected to criminal structures outside, those who command respect through their criminal resume or connections to thieves-in-law. The overseer is the link between this internal hierarchy and the external criminal world. He ensures that disputes among prisoners are resolved according to thieves' law. He collects contributions to the obshchak from prisoners who have money or property. He maintains order in ways that prison administration often finds convenient, handling problems through informal justice rather than official disciplinary procedures. Lysenko's network of overseers gave him influence over nearly every major correctional facility in Ukraine. When prisoners had disputes, they might be resolved not through official channels, but through appeals to Lysenko's representative, who would make a judgment based on criminal codes. When money needed to be sent to imprisoned criminals' families, it flowed through channels Lysenko controlled. When decisions needed to be made about how prisoners would respond to new regulations or policies, Lysenko's overseers shaped those responses. He was, in effect, the shadow administrator of a parallel justice system operating within the official prison system. One incident illustrates how this system could be weaponized. A human rights organization received a complaint from a prisoner in a Ukrainian colony describing horrific torture. Guards regularly raping inmates, driving needles under fingernails, burning prisoners with cigarettes. The rights organization demanded an investigation. Authorities inspected the facility. No evidence of torture was found. According to one version of events that circulated in law enforcement circles, Lysenko had fabricated the complaint to cause problems for the prison administration. His goal, allegedly, was to get the existing administration removed and replaced with officials more sympathetic to allowing traditional criminal codes to govern internal prison affairs. Whether this version was accurate or merely rumor, it demonstrated the level of control he was believed to exercise, the ability to manufacture scandals to remove uncooperative prison officials. This control over prisons served multiple purposes. It maintained his status within the criminal world, a thief-in-law who couldn't heat up zones by supporting imprisoned criminals would lose respect rapidly. It created a recruitment pipeline. Young criminals in prison were exposed to the codes and hierarchies, learning from older criminals and being evaluated for potential rise through criminal ranks. It provided intelligence. Prison networks heard about planned operations, about who was cooperating with authorities, about shifting alliances in the criminal world. And it generated money. Imprisoned criminals with resources contributed to the obshchak, and families outside sent money to support their imprisoned relatives, with percentages flowing to the hierarchy. Meanwhile, the pattern of detentions continued. February 26, 2018, brought one of the most publicized arrests. Lysenko was detained in Khmelnytsky Oblast, along with a local criminal authority. According to Vyacheslav Abroskin, then deputy head of the National Police, Lysenko was traveling to a colony to administer righteous justice. Abroskin posted on social media, "He is not a judge and never will be. He is a thief who will first lie face down in the dirt and then serve his sentence behind bars for his crimes." The post included photos of Lysenko face down on the ground, hands zip-tied behind his back, surrounded by armed police in tactical gear. It looked like a significant arrest. Media covered it extensively. Officials gave statements about finally bringing this criminal authority to justice. But within 3 hours, Lysenko was free. Released under a written promise not to leave the jurisdiction, the same meaningless promise he'd given numerous times before. The problem was fundamental. Ukraine had attempted to pass legislation making membership in the criminal hierarchy itself a crime, creating penalties specifically for being a thief-in-law. But Parliament had rejected this legislation. Without it, authorities could only prosecute specific criminal acts, and Lysenko was careful. He didn't personally rob, extort, or assault. He mediated. He advised. He collected tribute through subordinates. These activities were criminal in nature, but nearly impossible to prosecute under existing statutes. As one law enforcement official explained with frustration, formally, there's nothing to charge him with. He's a resolver, a mediator, a judge for the criminal world, but he hasn't personally committed crimes in years. The system can't touch him. This was the central paradox. Everyone knew what Lysenko was, what he did, how he operated. He himself didn't hide it. He gave interviews to Ukrainian television where he explained that being a thief-in-law was a way of life, and that imprisoning someone for their way of life was undemocratic. The brazenness was stunning. He was essentially telling authorities, yes, I'm a thief-in-law. Yes, I operate according to criminal codes. And no, you can't do anything about it. December 28, 2019 brought another detention, this time in Ivano-Frankivsk. Again, Lysenko was released quickly. This would be his last documented arrest before events that would shake not just the criminal underworld, but the entire country. Between these periodic detentions, Lysenko maintained his lifestyle, splitting time between Sumy and Moscow, attending criminal gatherings, mediating disputes, overseeing his network of subordinates and overseers. His son lived in Moscow, having inherited his father's attraction to criminality and having served his own prison time. The generational transmission of criminal culture continued. But Lysenko's comfortable existence was about to be disrupted by something more serious than police detentions: geopolitics. In October 2021, Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, NSDC, implemented sanctions against criminal authorities. The sanctions targeted thieves-in-law and other organized crime figures, freezing assets and restricting movement. Lysenko was included on this list. The sanctions represented a new approach. If criminal prosecution was impossible, perhaps economic and administrative measures could limit these individuals' operations. Then came a bizarre twist. On October 15, 2021, NSDC Secretary Alexei Danilov announced during a briefing that an error had been made in the sanctions decision. The error allegedly affected 108 people on the list. The Ministry of Internal Affairs, which had compiled the list, had supposedly made mistakes. And among those potentially affected by this error was Lysenko. The announcement provoked outrage and mockery. How could there be an error about whether someone was a thief-in-law or not? Either he was or he wasn't. Either he should be sanctioned or he shouldn't. The suggestion that his inclusion was a mistake seemed absurd, given his decades-long criminal career and multiple convictions. The incident revealed profound dysfunction in Ukraine's approach to organized crime. Even when authorities attempted new measures beyond traditional prosecution, bureaucratic incompetence or corruption undermined the effort. Whether the error was legitimate bureaucratic confusion or whether it reflected pressure from corrupt officials connected to criminal networks remained unclear. But the effect was the same. One of Ukraine's most powerful criminal authorities might escape sanctions due to an administrative mistake. The message to organized crime was clear. The system remained too weak, too corrupt, or too incompetent to effectively challenge criminal power structures. Around this time, an incident occurred that illustrated how criminal authority could be challenged not by police, but by other criminals. In Kiev's Pechersk district, a group of Chechens confronted a man named Savchuk, who was involved in a scheme stealing luxury cars from the European Union through fraudulent leasing arrangements. The Chechens forcibly took from him an armored Mercedes-Benz G-Class. Initially, this seemed like a simple dispute between criminals over stolen property. But, according to sources in the criminal world, the Mercedes didn't actually belong to Savchuk. Lysenko had given it to him to sell. The Chechens, in taking the vehicle, had effectively stolen from Lysenko himself. This created a delicate situation. The Chechens represented a different criminal network, one with connections to Caucasian criminal structures. Taking property from a thief-in-law was a serious matter in criminal hierarchy. It could be interpreted as disrespect, as a challenge to authority. Under traditional criminal codes, such an insult would need to be addressed, either through negotiation and compensation or through violence. The incident remained unresolved in public reports, but it demonstrated that even powerful thieves-in-law weren't immune to challenges, particularly from rival ethnic criminal networks that operated according to somewhat different codes and hierarchies. Savchuk himself was a known figure in criminal circles. In summer 2016, he had attended a gathering of thieves-in-law and criminal authorities at a cottage complex outside Kiev. Police raided that meeting, detaining numerous participants. These gatherings, called shodkas, were crucial to maintaining criminal hierarchy. They were where disputes were resolved, where new thieves were sometimes crowned, where territorial boundaries were negotiated, where tribute was collected and distributed. Police attempted to disrupt them, but the gatherings continued, sometimes more discreetly but often quite openly, reflecting the criminals' confidence that even when detected and raided, serious consequences were unlikely. By 2021, Lysenko had been operating at the top of Ukraine's criminal hierarchy for nearly a decade since Mamed's death. He was 67 years old, an age when most men are retired. But thieves-in-law don't retire. The title is for life. The obligations are permanent, and Lysenko showed no signs of slowing down. His network remained active. His overseers controlled prisons. His subordinates managed operations across multiple criminal sectors. His authority extended from his base in Sumy throughout central Ukraine, with particular influence in Kiev through his ally Nedelya. Then came February 24, 2022. Russian forces crossed the border in a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The attack came from multiple directions, but one of the main thrusts came through Sumy Oblast, Lysenko's territory, the region he'd controlled for decades, his hometown. Russian columns advanced towards Sumy city itself. Fighting broke out in villages and towns across the oblast. Ukrainian military and territorial defense forces organized resistance. And suddenly, the entire structure of Ukrainian society, including its criminal underworld, faced a fundamental choice. From Russia came a message distributed through criminal networks. Thieves-in-law should not participate in the war. Prisoners should not volunteer to fight. Taking up arms for the state violated thieves' law. The criminal world should remain neutral, should sit out the conflict. This message aligned with traditional codes. Thieves don't serve the state, don't fight the state's wars, maintain independence from all political authority. For decades, this principle had been sacrosanct. Thieves who violated it by cooperating with authorities or serving in military could be dethroned, stripped of their title and authority. But Lysenko was watching Russian tanks roll through his homeland. Sumy was under attack. The places he'd known his entire life were becoming battlefields. His network, his people, his territory were being destroyed. And he made a decision that would send shockwaves through the entire post-Soviet criminal underworld. He broke the code. He publicly stated that anyone could take up arms to defend their land, regardless of criminal codes. He allegedly provided financial support to territorial defense units in Sumy Oblast. And most significantly, when Ukrainian authorities began recruiting prisoners to fight, offering them freedom in exchange for military service, Lysenko gave his blessing. This was unprecedented. A thief-in-law, one of the most respected authorities in the post-Soviet criminal world, was telling prisoners they could serve in the military without violating thieves' law. He was, in effect, rewriting the code. Oleg Tsvili, a journalist specializing in organized crime, later described the significance. "I haven't heard of thieves-in-law fighting in the armed forces of Ukraine, but when they started recruiting in colonies, prisoners began enlisting thanks to Lera Sumskoy." He stated that anyone can take up arms, despite the concepts, and defend their land. You could say he blessed them, not fearing colleagues who opposed this. Today, thieves are divided into two parts. Some support the war, others don't. The division was profound. Russian thieves-in-law, and those aligned with them, condemned Lysenko's position as a betrayal of fundamental principles. Ukrainian and some other thieves supported it as a pragmatic response to existential threat. The criminal world, which prided itself on operating above politics and nationalism, suddenly found itself split along the same geopolitical fault lines as the legitimate world. The war forced everyone to choose sides, even those who'd spent lifetimes claiming to stand outside such choices. Lysenko's motivation remains debated. Was it genuine patriotism, a man choosing his homeland over his criminal code? Was it pragmatic calculation, recognizing that if Ukraine fell to Russian control, his own position might be threatened by Russian-aligned criminals? Was it a mix of both? Law enforcement officials were skeptical. One source told media, "I haven't heard about Lera Sumskoy helping territorial defense. What I do know is that the war created new opportunities for criminal business. They're smuggling Ukrainian men across the border. That's extremely profitable now, and everything else has become secondary. Some thieves-in-law have even become volunteers to legitimize themselves." The source cited Nodar Rustovsky, a Soyan, a thief-in-law who attempted to exchange his Russian citizenship for Ukrainian under the guise of volunteering after Interpol put him on a wanted list. The war indeed created new criminal opportunities. As military-age Ukrainian men faced mobilization, some sought to flee the country. Criminal networks offered services, forged documents, bribed border guards, smuggling routes through neighboring countries. The prices were astronomical, ranging from thousands to tens of thousands of dollars per person. For criminal organizations, this became a more lucrative business than drugs or weapons. The desperation of people trying to escape war created a market where they would pay anything, sell anything, to get their sons or husbands across the border. Corruption also flourished in military procurement. Billions of dollars in international aid flowed into Ukraine. Much of it went to legitimate defense needs, but some percentage inevitably disappeared into the shadow economy. Criminal networks with existing corruption connections in government and military found new opportunities. Equipment purchased at inflated prices, contracts awarded to shell companies, supplies diverted and sold on black markets. The war created chaos, and chaos always benefits organized crime. But the fundamental question remained: what had Lysenko actually done? The reports about his support for territorial defense were vague, based on sources within criminal circles rather than documented evidence. He hadn't been photographed in military uniform. He hadn't given public interviews about supporting the war effort. Everything was rumor and intelligence reports, the same murky information that surrounded all his activities. It was possible he'd made statements privately that circulated through prison networks and criminal channels. It was possible he'd provided money through intermediaries. It was also possible the entire narrative was exaggerated, that he'd simply not opposed prisoners volunteering, as Russian thieves had, and this neutral stance was being interpreted as active support. What was clear was that the war divided the criminal underworld in ways that would have lasting consequences. Tzvili noted, "There's a redistribution happening in criminal concepts in Ukraine, and after the war, there will be many scores to settle. Who acted with conscience? Who acted by concepts?" The criminal world, which operated on rigid hierarchies and codes, now faced an internal conflict about what those codes meant in the context of war. Could a thief-in-law support state military action? Could prisoners serve in an army? Could criminals be patriots? These questions had no precedent, no traditional answers. Then, in November 2024, the most recent chapter in Lysenko's story emerged from an unlikely source: a wiretap investigation into drug distribution in a Ukrainian prison. Authorities had been monitoring communications related to what they believed was a systematic narcotics smuggling operation in Stryjavska Correctional Colony No. 81, located in Vinnytsia Oblast in central Ukraine. The investigation had been ongoing since summer 2024, with operatives collecting evidence about how drugs were being moved into the facility, who was organizing the distribution, and who was profiting from the trade inside the prison walls. This was routine work. Prison drug investigations happened regularly, usually resulting in arrests of low-level dealers and corrupt guards, while the real organizers remained untouched. But during the wiretap surveillance, investigators intercepted something unexpected. In a phone conversation, one of the suspects mentioned receiving orders from Lera Sumskoy to eliminate the current overseer at the colony. The implication was clear. Lysenko had allegedly ordered a hit on a criminal authority within the prison, presumably to replace him with someone more loyal or cooperative. On November 21, 2024, authorities conducted searches. The next day, they officially announced suspicion against what they termed the electric murderer, the individual who allegedly planned to carry out the killing. According to the prosecution's interpretation of the intercepted communications, the suspect had discussed with an associate how he'd received direct instructions from Lysenko during a meeting to deal with the current overseer. The case represented several significant developments. First, at age 70, Lysenko remained actively involved in managing Ukraine's prison hierarchies, giving orders that subordinates followed. The war hadn't diminished his influence over the correctional system. Second, he was willing to use violence or threats of violence to maintain control. Eliminating a rival overseer demonstrated the same ruthlessness that had characterized his entire career. Third, despite decades of law enforcement awareness, despite countless investigations, despite his status as one of Ukraine's most well-known criminal figures, he apparently still operated with sufficient confidence to order hits over communications that could potentially be monitored. Looking at Lysenko's complete arc, from teenage hooligan in 1972 to 70-year-old criminal authority in 2024, revealed patterns that extended beyond one individual. The Soviet prison system had created him, providing an alternative socialization that valued criminal skills over legitimate ones. The chaos of the 1990s had given him opportunity, creating spaces where criminal networks could thrive. The persistent weakness and corruption of post-Soviet institutions had protected him, making prosecution nearly impossible despite universal awareness of his activities. And now war was transforming him again, from pure criminal authority into something more ambiguous. A figure who claimed to defend his homeland while maintaining criminal power structures. Each detention told the same story. Police would arrest him, announce they finally had him, hold him briefly, then release him. The pattern repeated so many times it became farcical. The photo from February 2018 showed him face down in dirt, hands zip-tied, surrounded by armed police. It looked like decisive action. 3 hours later, he walked free. The image captured the fundamental reality. Force could temporarily subdue him, but the system couldn't hold him. Something was broken at a level deeper than any individual case. The Obszczak represented another dimension of his power. Traditional thieves-in-law were supposed to maintain collective criminal funds that supported imprisoned criminals and their families. This wasn't personal wealth, it was communal money held in trust for the criminal world. In practice, of course, the line between collective funds and personal resources blurred significantly. Those who controlled Obszczak had power. They decided who received support, who got loans for criminal enterprises, who could afford good lawyers. The economics of the criminal world flowed through these funds, and Lysenko controlled significant portions of them. His network wasn't just about authority and respect, it was about money. Substantial amounts of money generated through dozens of revenue streams and managed through sophisticated informal banking systems. When he acquired land in 2015, despite prohibitions against thieves owning property, he was following a path many had taken, maintaining public adherence to codes while privately accumulating assets. The hypocrisy bothered some purists in the criminal world, but most understood it as simple pragmatism. You couldn't operate for 50 years at the highest levels without accumulating some wealth, and you couldn't accumulate wealth without owning property through various fronts and proxies. The codes adapted to reality, or rather, people found ways to appear to follow codes while doing what they wanted. His family situation showed similar adaptation. Traditional codes prohibited official family. No marriage certificates, no acknowledged children. But Lysenko had a wife in Moscow and a son who'd also served time. Many thieves-in-law had made similar arrangements by the 2000s, maintaining the fiction of family independence while having actual families. The institution evolved, keeping the appearance and rhetoric of old traditions while practicing modern compromises. This flexibility helped explain its survival. It wasn't a rigid system resisting change, but an adaptive one that incorporated changes while maintaining core elements. The relationship with Moscow police was particularly interesting. Russian authorities clearly knew who he was. They detained him multiple times, but they never prosecuted him seriously. The detentions seemed more like boundary setting. You can visit, but don't stay too long. Don't operate too openly. Russian thieves-in-law who supported him maintained their positions. The message appeared to be that Ukrainian criminals could have Russian connections, but should keep their primary operations in Ukraine. This aligned with how Russian security services had historically managed criminal networks, tolerating or even utilizing them for various purposes while maintaining enough control to prevent them from becoming threats. The Mercedes incident with Chechen criminals illustrated how ethnic dimensions shaped criminal networks. Caucasian criminal groups, Chechens, Georgians, Armenians, operated according to somewhat different codes than Slavic criminals. The competition between these groups had defined much of post-Soviet organized crime. Lysenko had built his rise partly on opposing Caucasian expansion into Ukrainian criminal territories, positioning himself as representing Slavic interests. When Chechens took his vehicle, they were potentially challenging this arrangement. How such challenges were resolved? Through negotiation, through violence, through appeals to higher-level criminal authorities, remained opaque to outsiders, but was crucial to maintaining criminal hierarchies. The birthday celebration that opened this story represented a moment when criminal hierarchy became visible to the public. Usually these networks operated invisibly. The meetings happened in private, the deals were made behind closed doors, the violence occurred in ways that didn't attract attention. But occasionally, something became public. 28 thieves-in-law gathered openly in a restaurant. Media covered it. Photos circulated. And then, nothing happened. They all walked free. These moments of visibility, followed by impunity, were almost calculated demonstrations of power. Look at us. Everyone knows who we are, and nobody can stop us. Ukraine's attempt to implement sanctions in 2021 represented a different approach. If criminal prosecution was impossible, try administrative and economic pressure. Freeze assets, restrict travel, make operation more difficult through bureaucratic means. But even this encountered the error problem, the mysterious determination that 108 people, including Lysenko, had been improperly included. Whether the error was legitimate incompetence or deliberate sabotage, the effect was the same. Even new approaches to combating organized crime ran into the same institutional failures that plagued traditional prosecution. The November 2024 case, the alleged murder plot in the prison, showed that despite everything, despite age and public exposure and decades of investigation, Lysenko remained actively engaged in the most serious criminal activities. Ordering a hit on a prison overseer was attempted murder. If proven in court, it could finally result in serious prison time. But past experience suggested skepticism was warranted. The evidence was circumstantial. The witness was a criminal facing his own charges. The investigation would proceed through a system that had failed countless times before. Betting on conviction seemed unwise. And even if convicted, even if imprisoned, what would that accomplish? His network would continue. His subordinates would maintain operations. Someone else would take formal leadership while awaiting his release. The system that produced him and protected him would remain intact. The institutional dysfunctions, the corruption, the gaps between official law and actual power. None of that would change because one 70-year-old criminal finally went to prison. He was symptom, not cause. The comparison to Italian Mafia figures was obvious but imperfect. Italy had eventually developed tools to combat organized crime. Special prosecutors, witness protection programs, laws targeting criminal associations rather than just individual crimes, sustained political will to fight corruption. The process took decades and remained incomplete, but progress was real. Post-Soviet countries had tried to import some of these approaches, but with limited success. The cultural, legal, and political contexts were too different. What worked in Italy didn't necessarily translate to Ukraine or Russia. Some analysts argued that strong authoritarian states could suppress organized crime more effectively than democracies. Russia, under Putin, had indeed cracked down on some criminal networks, particularly those that challenged state authority or competed with state-connected criminal enterprises. But this wasn't really suppression of organized crime. It was subordination of criminal networks to state control. The distinction mattered. Crime didn't disappear. It was incorporated into power structures. Whether that was better or worse than the Ukrainian situation, where criminal networks operated semi-independently, was debatable. For ordinary Ukrainians, the existence of figures like Lysenko created constant frustration. They paid taxes that supposedly funded police and courts. They voted in elections that supposedly chose their leaders. They lived under a constitution that supposedly guaranteed rule of law. But everyone knew that parallel power structures existed, that criminals operated with impunity, that official authority was often meaningless. This created cynicism that corroded democratic institutions further. If the system doesn't work, why participate in it? If criminals run things anyway, why trust government? The vicious cycle continued. International observers often misunderstood the phenomenon, viewing it through frameworks that didn't apply. These weren't mafias in the Italian sense, tightly organized, hierarchical groups controlling specific territories through systematic violence. They weren't cartels in the Latin American sense, business enterprises focused purely on maximizing drug trafficking profits. They were something distinct, hybrid networks mixing Soviet prison culture, post-Soviet chaos, ethnic loyalties, business interests, and adaptive traditions. The thieves-in-law institution was unique to the former Soviet space, and understanding it required understanding that unique context. Lysenko himself remained enigmatic, despite decades in the public eye. He gave few interviews. He made few public statements. Most information about him came from law enforcement, media investigations, or other criminals. His motivations beyond power and status were unclear. What did he actually think about his life, his choices, his legacy? Did he view himself as criminal or as an alternative authority figure providing services society needed? Did he ever question the codes he'd lived by? Did the war force any genuine moral reckoning? Or was his support for Ukrainian defense pure calculation? These questions had no clear answers. What was clear was that at 70, after 6 convictions and 23 years in prison, after countless detentions and investigations, after becoming one of the most publicly identified criminals in Ukraine, Sergey Ivanovich Lysenko remained free and powerful. He remained Lera Sumskoy, thief-in-law, overseer of prisons, alleged controller of an oblast, operator of criminal networks spanning multiple countries. The state had thrown everything at him for decades and failed. He had outlasted multiple governments, survived regime changes, adapted to war, and continued operating. This wasn't a story with a satisfying ending, because the story wasn't over. Lysenko was still alive, still active, still committing crimes according to the latest allegations. No dramatic arrest, no final trial, no justice served. Just the grinding continuation of a broken system producing the same results year after year. The newest case might finally be different. Probably it wouldn't be. The pattern was too established, too reliable. For anyone trying to understand post-Soviet societies, Lysenko's career offered a perfect case study. You could learn more about how power actually functioned from his story than from reading constitutions or election results. The formal structures mattered less than the informal networks. Official titles meant less than criminal reputations. Legal authority was weaker than traditional hierarchies. And the spaces between law and practice, between what systems claimed to be and what they actually were, contained entire parallel universes where different rules applied. The tragedy was that everyone saw it. This wasn't hidden corruption or secret criminal enterprises. It was public, obvious, documented extensively. Moskal stated it plainly in Parliament. Media reported it constantly. Everyone in Sumy knew. Everyone in law enforcement knew. But knowing changed nothing. The gap between awareness and action, between understanding a problem and solving it, remained unbridgeable. And in that gap, men like Lysenko thrived for their entire lives, untouchable and powerful, living proof that the post-Soviet transition to rule of law remained incomplete 30 years after it supposedly began. So Lera Sumskoy continues his existence, somewhere between Sumy and Moscow. A 70-year-old criminal authority whose story encompasses Soviet prisons, post-Soviet chaos, multiple governments' failed attempts at prosecution, a war that split the criminal world along geopolitical lines, and the most recent allegation of ordering murder from behind the scenes. Whether he will ever face meaningful consequences remains uncertain. Whether the systems that enabled him will ever reform is equally questionable. Whether the institution of thieves-in-law will survive another generation is unknown. What is certain is that for now, in late 2024, the man who allegedly rules more effectively than governors, who walks free despite everyone knowing his crimes, who adapted criminal codes to bless prisoners fighting for their country while maintaining his criminal empire, that man remains free, powerful, and untouchable, the living embodiment of everything broken in post-Soviet justice.